June 4th, 1944, 11:23 in the morning, 150 miles off the coast of West Africa. A massive steel beast explodes through the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at a 45-degree angle. Water cascades off its hull like waterfalls. Black diesel smoke mixes with white spray. The conning tower breaks clear, machine gun fire stitching across its metal skin, and 59 German sailors begin jumping into the sea. This is U-505, a Type IXE submarine, 252 feet of predatory engineering that has hunted Allied shipping for nearly 3 years. Right now it's dying. Its rudder is jammed hard to starboard, sending it into an endless right-hand circle. The stern is settling lower with every revolution. Inside, water is flooding through deliberately open valves. 14 demolition charges have been armed. The crew has abandoned ship. In 18 minutes, this submarine will sink to the bottom of the Atlantic, unless 9 American sailors can save it. But here's what makes this impossible. The United States Navy hasn't captured an enemy warship on the high seas since the War of 1812, 132 years ago. The last captain who tried it used cannons and cutlasses. These men have less than 20 minutes, no idea what's waiting for them inside, and absolutely no training for what they're about to attempt. One of them, a 25-year-old machinist mate from Massachusetts, is about to dive into a flooded, booby-trapped submarine that could explode at any second. His name is Zenon Lukosius. He's never been inside a German U-boat. He doesn't speak German. He has no blueprints, no technical diagrams, and no way to know which valve will save the submarine and which will kill him. But he's going in anyway, because 2 days from now, Allied forces will storm the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And locked inside this sinking submarine are code books, Enigma cipher machines, and 900 pounds of classified documents that could help win the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, the campaign that has already killed over 70,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen. If U-505 sinks, all of that goes to the bottom with it. This is the story of how it didn't. This is the story of 9 minutes that changed naval warfare forever. And it begins with the unluckiest submarine in the Kriegsmarine. U-505 was commissioned on August 26, 1941, in Hamburg, Germany. She was a Type IXE ocean-going submarine, the kind designed to hunt far from European waters, to cross the Atlantic and strangle Allied supply lines in the Caribbean, off the coast of Africa, and deep in the South Atlantic where no help was coming. She was good at her job. Over 12 war patrols. She sank 8 merchant ships, British, American, Norwegian, Dutch, and Colombian. 45,000 gross tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Cargo that would never reach Britain. Oil that would never fuel Allied tanks. Food that would never feed Allied soldiers. But by 1943, U-505 had become something else. Cursed. For months at a time, she would patrol and find nothing. Her crew would spend 80 days at sea, hunting convoys that never appeared, firing torpedoes that missed, and returning to base with every weapon still aboard and nothing to show for the risk, the fear, and the claustrophobic horror of life in an iron tube where 48 men shared 30 bunks and the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and terror became the only atmosphere they knew. And then came October 24th, 1943. East of the Azores, U-505 was running deep and silent, trying to evade a British destroyer that had caught her scent. Depth charges were falling, the kind of underwater explosions that crushed submarines like beer cans, that made rivets pop like bullets, that drove men insane with the waiting, the helplessness, and the knowledge that the next one might be the one that imploded the hull and drowned them all in seconds. In the control room, surrounded by his crew, Captain Lieutenant Peter Czech pulled out his service pistol and shot himself in the head. He was 25 years old. He was the first and only U-boat commander to commit suicide in active command. And he did it in front of everyone. In front of the men who depended on him, who trusted him, who needed him to get them home. The executive officer took command, somehow got the boat to the surface, and somehow made it back to France. But something broke in that control room that day. something that couldn't be repaired in any dry dock. When U-505 went back to sea in December 1943 under a new captain, Oberleutnant Zursee Harold Lang, a young officer promoted beyond his experience. The crew carried Peter Czech's ghost with them. Some of them believed the boat was haunted. Others just believed it was doomed. They were both right. By March 1944, U-505 was on what would be her final patrol. 80 days in the Gulf of Guinea, hunting Allied shipping off the coast of West Africa. 80 days, and not a single ship sunk. Not one torpedo fired in anger. Just endless days of heat, mechanical breakdowns, dwindling supplies, and the growing certainty that this unlucky boat was going to kill them all eventually. On June 4th, 1944, they were heading home, running on the surface to recharge batteries. Tired, hungry, ready to be done. And that's when they ran into Captain Daniel V. Gallery's hunter-killer group. Captain Daniel Gallery was 43 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, and completely obsessed with an idea that most people thought was insane. He wanted to capture a German U-boat intact. Not sink it, capture it. This had never been done. The British had captured U-boats, but those were boats that had already surrendered or were found abandoned, or were so damaged they couldn't scuttle themselves. Gallery wanted to do something different. He wanted to board an enemy submarine while it was still operational, take it by force, and bring it home as a prize of war. He commanded Task Group 22.3, the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, and 5 destroyer escorts: Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty, Chatelaine, and Jenks. They were a hunter-killer group designed to find German submarines and destroy them. But Gallery had trained his crews for something else. For months, he had run boarding drills. 9-man teams would practice jumping into whaleboats, rowing to a mock-up submarine hull, and climbing aboard with tools and weapons and no idea what they'd find inside. They practiced in calm seas, in rough seas, in daylight and darkness. They practiced until the movements became automatic. Gallery's superior officers thought he was wasting time. The British Admiralty thought he was dangerous. Capturing a U-boat meant the Germans might find out, might realize their codes were compromised, might change their Enigma cipher settings, and blind the entire Allied code-breaking effort. But Gallery believed. He believed it could be done. He believed it was worth doing. He just needed the right target. On June 4th, 1944, at 11:10 in the morning, the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine got a sonar contact. Something submerged, moving slowly, about 1,000 yards out. Gallery gave the order: investigate and attack. Nobody knew it yet, but the unluckiest submarine in the German Navy was about to meet the most obsessed submarine hunter in the American Navy. And in 13 minutes, everything was going to change. 11:10 a.m. USS Chatelaine sonar operator called it out. Contact submerged, bearing 270, range 1,000 yards. Commander Dudley Knox ordered the ship to close. Below the surface, U-505 was running at periscope depth, trying to recharge batteries while staying hidden. They didn't know they'd been found. Not yet. 11:16 a.m. Chatelaine fired 24 Hedgehog projectiles, small anti-submarine mortars that launched ahead of the ship in a circular pattern designed to explode on contact with the submarine's hull. Inside U-505, the crew heard the splashes, felt the boat lurch as Captain Lang ordered an emergency dive, held their breath. Silence. The Hedgehogs missed, all 24 of them. The crew exhaled, but Chatelaine wasn't done. Knox ordered the ship to open range, set depth charges for a shallow pattern, and come around for another attack. Meanwhile, 2 F-4F Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal arrived overhead, strafing the water with machine gun fire to mark the submarine's position. The sonar operator called it out again. Contact regained, bearing 268, range 400 yards. 2 degrees off from the visual bearing the Wildcats were marking. Remarkable accuracy. Deadly accuracy. 11:21 a.m. Chatelaine dropped 14 depth charges in a perfect pattern, set to explode at shallow depth. Inside U-505, the world ended. The first explosion threw men against bulkheads. The second knocked out all electrical power. The lights died, emergency lighting kicked in red and dim, and the diesel smell turned acrid with ozone and fear. The third explosion jammed the rudder hard to starboard and disabled the auxiliary steering controls. The fourth opened seams in the aft compartments, and water began spraying through pipe joints. Hans Gobler, a machinist's mate who would survive to write about this moment 60 years later, remembered it like this. Water broke in. Light and all electrical machinery went off, and the rudders jammed. I thought we were done for. Captain Lang knew they were. The depth charges had crippled his boat. They couldn't dive. The aft compartments were flooding. They couldn't steer. The rudder was locked. They couldn't fight. They had no power for the electric motors. He gave the only order left. Emergency blow. Surface. Compressed air screamed into the ballast tanks, forcing water out, driving the submarine upward. At 11:23 a.m., U-505 broke the surface at a steep angle, water cascading off her hull, 150 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by 4 American warships. Lang climbed the ladder to the conning tower to assess the situation. What he saw made his decision for him. USS Chatelaine, 600 yards to starboard, machine guns firing. USS Pillsbury, 800 yards to port, turning to engage. USS Jenks, closing from astern. 2 Wildcat fighters overhead, strafing runs tearing across the deck. And his submarine was circling uncontrollably to the right, the stern settling lower, and the crew was panicking below. Lang was hit almost immediately, multiple rounds through both legs, shrapnel in his knees. He fell to the deck, bleeding, and gave the order that should have ended U-505's story. Abandon ship. Scuttle the boat. The order echoed down through the boat. Alle Mann raus. Versenkung's Maßnahmen. Boot springen. Everyone out. Scuttling measures. Blow the boat. This was standard procedure. Every U-boat crew drilled for this moment. If you couldn't fight and couldn't escape, you destroyed your submarine before the enemy could capture it. You protected your codes, your technology, and your secrets. The engineering crew moved fast. In the control room, they opened the sea strainer, a basket-shaped valve that, when removed, allows seawater to flood directly into the ballast tanks. Water began pouring in immediately, gushing like an open fire hydrant. They armed 14 demolition charges, explosives placed throughout the submarine, designed to blow holes in the hull and destroy sensitive equipment. Some in the control room, some in the engine rooms, some in the torpedo rooms, all with fuses, all set to detonate, all capable of killing anyone still inside when they went off. They opened cooling water intakes, open vents, did everything they were trained to do to ensure the submarine would sink. And then they ran. 59 men climbed the ladder to the conning tower, grabbed life vests, and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. The wounded Captain Lang was helped into the water, bleeding from both legs. One sailor, Gottfried Fischer, was cut down by machine gun fire on the deck and died there, the only German casualty of the engagement. From surface to last man off, less than 2 minutes. U-505 was still circling, still moving, still afloat. But not for long. The sea strainer was open. Water was flooding in at high pressure. The demolition charges were armed. The stern was going under. 18 minutes, maybe less, before the Atlantic claimed her. Captain Gallery was watching through binoculars from the bridge of the USS Guadalcanal, 3 miles away. He saw the submarine's surface, saw the crew abandon ship, saw the boat circling, stern low, diesel smoke pouring from the open hatches. And he saw that it was still afloat. Every instinct in naval warfare said, finish it. Put a torpedo into her. Send her down. Mission accomplished. But Gallery had spent 6 months training boarding parties. 6 months drilling his crews for this exact moment. 6 months preparing for something that hadn't been done in 132 years. And now here it was. The unluckiest submarine in the Kriegsmarine, crippled and abandoned, circling in front of him like a wounded animal. He made his decision in seconds. Away boarding party. Away boarding party. He radioed USS Pillsbury, ship that just fired hedgehogs, stand by to board. On Pillsbury, Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David heard the order and felt his stomach drop. He was 41 years old, older than most junior officers, a career Navy man who'd already earned 2 Navy crosses in previous actions. He knew what Gallery was asking. He also knew he was going to do it. Boarding party to the whaleboat. Now, 9 men grabbed tools, weapons, and flashlights. They lowered a whaleboat, a small rowing craft, and began pulling toward the circling submarine. 300 yards across open water, with U-505 still moving, still flooding, and no way to know what was waiting for them inside. Lieutenant Albert David, leader. Chief George Jacobson, second in command. Motor machinist's mate first class Zenon Lukosius, 25 years old, was the man who would save the boat. Gunner's mate Chester McCarsky. Bosun's mate Wayne Pickles. Torpedo man Arthur Nispel. Electrician's mate William Riendo. Radio man Stanley Wadowick. Signalman Gordon Hone. 9 men. No blueprints. No training on German submarines. No idea if they were rowing toward a capture or a coffin. As they approached, they saw U-505 clearly for the first time. The conning tower was barely above water, riddled with bullet holes. The stern was almost submerged. Oil slicked the surface. The submarine was still moving in that endless right-hand turn, rudder jammed, describing a circle about 500 yards in diameter. They could hear water rushing inside the hull. They could smell diesel and chlorine gas mixing in the air. They could see that the deck was slippery with seawater and oil, that the boat was settling lower with every minute. What they couldn't see was whether German sailors were still inside, waiting with machine guns, whether the demolition charges were about to explode, whether the submarine would sink before they could even board her. Pickles threw a grappling hook and secured the whaleboat to the submarine's deck. The boat was still moving, still circling, making it nearly impossible to maintain position. Lieutenant David didn't wait. He jumped from the whaleboat onto U-505's deck, climbed the external ladder to the conning tower, and peered down the open hatch. Darkness. The sound of rushing water. The smell of diesel and fear. He climbed down alone. The Medal of Honor citation, awarded posthumously after David died of a heart attack 14 months later, described this moment in formal language. With full knowledge that the U-boat might sink at any moment or be blown up by exploding demolition and scuttling charges, Lieutenant David daringly boarded the submarine. But David didn't experience it in formal language. He experienced it as a ladder descending into darkness. As waist-deep water in the control room, cold Atlantic seawater mixed with diesel fuel soaked through his uniform. As emergency lighting throws red shadows across unfamiliar equipment. As the sound of flooding came from multiple sources, rushing, hissing, and the submarine groaning around him like a dying animal. As the absolute certainty that at any second, the demolition charges could explode and kill him instantly. He checked the forward compartments, empty. Checked aft, empty. No Germans waiting with guns. No ambush. They'd all abandoned ship, just like it looked, which meant the only enemy was the submarine itself. David climbed back to the conning tower and shouted up to the whaleboat. "It's clear. Get down here." 8 more men descended. Jacobson is coordinating, calling out assignments based on the gallery's training. Lukosius and Riendo to find the flooding source. McCarsky and Nispel to search for demolition charges. Wadowick to the radio room to grab intelligence materials. Hone to maintain communication with the surface. They spread out through the boat, flashlights cutting through the darkness, and the 9-minute race began. 11:30 a.m. Lieutenant David made his assessment. Primary flooding source in the control room. Water level rising rapidly. Submarine still circling, stern settling lower. Unknown number of demolition charges. Unknown time before detonation. No time for careful planning. No time for mistakes. Find a flooding source. David shouted. Close every valve you see. Move. Zenon Lukosius waded through the control room, water up to his waist, looking for where it was coming from. Not a broken pipe, too much water, too fast. Not battle damage. This was deliberate. Then he saw it. The sea strainer. A basket-shaped valve, maybe 18 inches across, located in the control room floor plates. Normally, it would have a cover, a heavy metal cap that sealed it shut. But the cover was gone, removed by the German crew before they abandoned ship, and seawater was pouring through the opening like an open fire hydrant. This was the primary flooding source. This was what was killing the submarine. Lukosius didn't hesitate. He took a breath and dove underwater into the flooded control room, groping in near darkness for the cover. His hands found it nearby. The Germans had left it close, probably planning to replace it after setting the other scuttling measures. But they'd run out of time or panicked or simply forgotten in the chaos of abandonment. He grabbed the cover, fitted it back onto the sea strainer threads, and turned it tight. The roar of flooding water cut off immediately. He surfaced, gasping, "Got it!" Primary flooding stopped, but the submarine was still taking on water from other sources, cooling water intakes, open vents, and seepage through damaged seams. And somewhere in the boat, 13 or 14 demolition charges were still armed. 11:33 a.m. Chester McCarskey and Arthur Nispel were searching for the charges. They knew from intelligence briefings that German U-boats carried demolition charges, but they didn't know exactly where, didn't know how many, and didn't know what they looked like or how they were armed. They searched by feel and intuition. Found the first one in the control room, wrapped in waterproof covering, fuses visible. McCarskey disarmed it carefully, removing the fuse and cutting the wires. They found another in the forward engine room, another in the aft torpedo room, another in the battery compartments. 13 charges total, each one capable of blowing a hole in the hull, each one capable of killing everyone aboard if it detonated. One by one, they disarmed them, hands steady despite the fear, despite the water still sloshing around their legs, despite the submarine groaning and settling beneath them. 13 charges found and disarmed. One charge, reportedly the 14th, was never found. Either it didn't exist, or it was hidden somewhere they couldn't reach, or it had never been properly armed. To this day, nobody knows for certain. 11:35 a.m. Commander Earl Trocino arrived with a second boarding party from USS Guadalcanal. 10 more men, pumps, tools, and engineering expertise. Trocino was the Guadalcanal's chief engineer, a civilian engineer before the war, and a man who understood ship systems at an intuitive level. He took one look at the flooding situation and knew they weren't done. Lukosius had stopped the primary source, but water was still coming in from a dozen secondary sources. If they didn't find and close those valves, the submarine would sink anyway, just slower. Trocino spent the next 4 hours in the bilges, crawling through oily water under the engines, squeezing into spaces barely wide enough for a human body, tracing pipelines in the dark, and closing valves by feel. In his own words later, "When I first went down into that submarine, I didn't think we'd save her. But you do what you have to do." Captain Gallery's action report praised Trocino specifically. He risked his life many times by squirming into inaccessible corners under the floor plates where he wouldn't have a chance to escape in case the sub started to sink. His total disregard of his own safety contributed materially to saving U-505. 11:39 a.m. 9 minutes after Lieutenant David first descended into the submarine, Zenon Lukosius sealed the sea strainer and stopped the primary flooding. The water level in the control room stopped rising. The submarine stopped dying. 11:45 a.m. Lieutenant David climbed to the conning tower and radioed USS Guadalcanal. "Submarine secured, Captain. We got her." Captain Gallery's voice came back, barely containing excitement. "Outstanding work, David. Can she be towed?" "Yes, sir. We'll need a fleet tug. The rudder's jammed, and she wants to circle, but we've stopped the flooding. She'll stay afloat. I'll get you a tug. Keep her alive, David. Keep her alive." Around U-505, the scene had transformed. USS Chatelaine and USS Jenks had recovered the 58 German survivors from the water. Captain Lang bleeding from both legs, 3 others wounded, and 54 frightened and exhausted men who'd expected to drown and instead found themselves prisoners of war. On the destroyer escort decks, those German sailors watched in disbelief as American boarding parties swarmed over their submarine, as pumps were brought aboard, and as U-505, which should have been at the bottom of the Atlantic, remained stubbornly on the surface. Captain Lang, receiving medical treatment, said to his captors in broken English, "You have my boat." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of defeat so total that he could barely process it. In the entire history of the Kriegsmarine, no U-boat had ever been captured intact by American forces. Sunk, yes. Forced to surrender after the war ended, yes. But captured during active combat, boarded by force, taken as a prize of war? Never. Until now. But the capture was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, keeping the secret. Because if Germany learned that U-505 had been captured, if they realized that American forces now possessed current Enigma machines, codebooks, grid charts, recognition signals, and operational orders, they would change every cipher setting immediately. The entire Allied code-breaking effort would collapse overnight. 58 German prisoners had to be kept completely isolated from all other POWs. Hundreds of American sailors who witnessed the capture had to keep their mouths shut. An entire submarine had to be hidden from German intelligence for the rest of the war. And first, they had to tow U-505 2,500 miles across the Atlantic to Bermuda, with a jammed rudder, battle damage, and the constant threat that the submarine might flood again and sink anyway. The fleet tug USS Abnaki arrived on June 5th and attached a tow line. For 15 days, Task Group 22.3 escorted the captured submarine across the Atlantic, maintaining radio silence, pumping continuously, and repairing damage as they went. Commander Trocino and a skeleton crew lived aboard U-505 during the entire tow, sleeping in shifts, monitoring for leaks, and closing valves as new ones were found. On June 13th, day 8 of the tow, heavy weather hit, and the submarine nearly sank again. Trocino spent the night in the bilges, tracing pipelines, and finding the critical valve that was allowing water to flood back in. By morning, U-505 was stable again. On June 19th, 1944, 15 days after the capture, U-505 was towed into Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. She had survived and held. The 58 survivors of U-505 were taken to Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a prisoner of war camp that held over 4,000 German POWs at its peak. But the U-505 crew didn't mix with the other prisoners. They were kept in complete isolation in a separate compound, guarded by college baseball players who'd been carefully selected because they could blend in and keep their mouths shut. The U-505 crew learned to play baseball. They worked in the camp, ate in the camp, and slept in the camp. For 3 years, they had no contact with other German prisoners. No Red Cross notifications were sent, a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, but deemed necessary to protect the secret. Their families in Germany were notified in August 1944 that U-505 had been lost with all hands. Mothers buried empty coffins. Wives were mourning black. Children grew up believing their fathers had died. And in Germany, the Kriegsmarine never suspected. They looked at the reports. U-505 attacked by American forces, crew abandoned ship, submarine presumed sunk, and filed it away as one more loss in a losing war. They didn't change the Enigma settings. They didn't alter their naval cipher. They didn't suspect that the Americans now possessed 2 M4 Enigma machines, complete sets of June 1944 codebooks, grid charts for the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, recognition signals, weather short signal books, and 900 pounds of classified documents. The capture had yielded genuine intelligence value. Not the war-winning breakthrough that Captain Gallery would later claim, but solid, useful intelligence nonetheless. The Enigma machines and codebooks confirmed that Allied code-breaking was accurate. The grid cipher chart, used for coastal navigation, was genuinely new. The British hadn't broken that system yet. The operational orders gave tactical insights into German U-boat deployments. But the greatest value wasn't what the Americans captured. It was what the Germans didn't know they'd lost. For 11 months, from June 4th, 1944, to May 16th, 1945, hundreds of people kept the secret. Gallery's crews, the boarding parties, the men who witnessed the capture, the intelligence officers who processed the capture materials, the guards at Camp Ruston, the Navy personnel in Bermuda who saw a German submarine under tow. Not one person leaked. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. And on May 16, 1945, the U.S. Navy finally announced the capture of U-505 to the public. The story made headlines around the world. U.S. Navy captures German U-boat, first enemy warship taken since 1812. The boarding party became famous overnight. Medals were awarded. Captain Gallery received the Distinguished Service Medal. The 9-man boarding party received Navy Crosses, the second highest military decoration in the United States, awarded for extraordinary heroism. And Lieutenant Albert David, who descended alone into a flooding submarine that could have exploded at any second, was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He never knew. On September 17, 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, 14 months after the capture, Albert David suffered a heart attack and died. He was 42 years old. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously to his widow, Florence. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, the 58 survivors of U-505 were finally released from Camp Ruston and sent home to Germany. Imagine that reunion. Walking up to your childhood home, knocking on the door. Your mother opens it and screams because you're dead. You died in 1944. She buried an empty coffin and mourned you for 3 years. And now you're standing in front of her alive. Some families were angry at the U.S. government for not notifying the Red Cross, at their own government for declaring them dead, and at the secrecy that had stolen 3 years of their lives. Others were simply grateful their sons and husbands had survived. Harold Lang returned to Germany and lived quietly, rarely speaking about the capture. He carried the shame of losing his submarine for the rest of his life, even though German Naval Command never blamed him. They thought he'd died with his crew. But Hans Goebbeler, the machinist's mate who'd opened the sea strainer on Captain Lang's orders, chose a different path. In the 1950s, Goebbeler began visiting the United States. He met Zenon Lukosius, the American who'd closed the valve Goebbeler had opened. The two men became friends. They attended U-505 reunions together. They gave joint presentations at the Museum of Science and Industry. They appeared in documentaries together, two old men who'd once been enemies, laughing and shaking hands. Goebbeler wrote in his memoir, published in 2005, "When I met Zenon years after the war, I realized we were both just young men doing our jobs. He closed the valve, I opened it. The war made us enemies, but time made us brothers." Lukosius said simply, "I didn't think about medals or glory. I thought, if I don't close that valve, we all drown. So I closed it." After the war, the U.S. Navy planned to scrap U-505 or use her as a target for torpedo practice. She'd served her intelligence purpose. She was just another obsolete submarine, expensive to maintain, no longer useful. But Captain Gallery, by then promoted to Rear Admiral, had other ideas. He launched a campaign to save U-505, to preserve her as a war memorial, and to ensure that the story of her capture wouldn't be forgotten. The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago agreed to take her. Chicago citizens raised $250,000, nearly $3 million in today's money, to bring the submarine to the city. The journey was epic. U-505 was towed from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, through the St. Lawrence Seaway, across the Great Lakes, and finally into Chicago. On June 26, 1954, thousands of Chicagoans lined the lakefront to watch as U-505 was beached at 57th Street. Then came the overland move, 800 feet from the lakeshore to the museum. Custom railway built. Traffic on Lakeshore Drive stopped for hours. The submarine, 252 feet long, 1,200 tons, inched forward at a walking pace. The move took 28 days. On September 25, 1954, U-505 was dedicated as a war memorial. The 9 boarding party members who were still alive attended. German survivors attended. World War II veterans wept openly. For 50 years, U-505 sat outdoors at the museum, exposed to Chicago weather, slowly deteriorating. Then in 2004, the museum built an underground climate-controlled exhibit, a massive indoor gallery that cost $35 million. U-505 was moved indoors, fully restored to her 1944 condition, and reopened to the public. Today, you can walk through U-505. You can stand in the control room, where Zenon Lukosius dove to close the sea strainer. You can see the torpedo tubes, the crew quarters, and the diesel engines. You can touch the periscope, look through the conning tower hatch, and imagine what it was like to live and fight in this cramped, dangerous machine. More than 500,000 people visit U-505 every year. She is one of only 4 surviving German World War II U-boats in the world. She is the only one in the United States, and she is the only one ever captured by the U.S. Navy. The capture of U-505 wasn't the decisive moment that won the Battle of the Atlantic. That battle was already turning in the Allies' favor by June 1944. The Enigma codes were already broken. German U-boats were already suffering catastrophic losses. 28,000 U-boat crew members would die by the end of the war, a 70% fatality rate, the highest of any branch of any military in World War II. But U-505's capture mattered anyway. It mattered because it proved something could be done that everyone said was impossible. Because it showed that courage and training and a little bit of luck could overcome overwhelming odds. Because 9 men climbed into a flooding submarine that could have killed them all, and they saved it anyway. It mattered because Lieutenant Albert David went first, alone, into darkness and danger, knowing he might die, but going anyway. Because Zenon Lukosius dove underwater in a flooded control room and found the valve that mattered. Because Commander Earl Trocino spent hours in toxic bilge water, tracing pipes he'd never seen before, finding the valves that kept U-505 alive. Because Captain Gallery trained his crews for 6 months for a mission everyone said was crazy. And when the moment came, those crews were ready. And it matters today because U-505 sits in Chicago, a monument to courage and mercy, where former enemies became friends, and where schoolchildren learn about the cost of war and the value of peace. Hans Gobler, who opened the sea strainer, and Zenon Lukosius, who closed it, stood together in that submarine in their 80s and hugged like brothers. That's the miracle. Not just that U-505 was captured, but the men who fought to sink her and the men who fought to save her found a way to forgive each other. The submarine that almost exploded in 1944 is now a symbol of peace. And it all happened in 9 minutes.